From the outside, everything about my family seemed perfect. At least, that's what I thought when I was younger. We had the big house, the family vacations, and the picture-perfect moments. But behind the smiles, there was a hidden story, a story of favoritism, neglect, and an overwhelming sense of being second best. And the worst part, it was all coming from the one person who was supposed to be my biggest supporter, my dad. It wasn't that my dad was a bad person. No, he just couldn't help himself. From the moment my brother was born, he was the golden child. He had my dad's attention, his admiration, and most importantly, his love. I was always just there. It wasn't as if I was ignored, but I could never quite measure up to the idea of what my dad wanted in a son. My brother, on the other hand, could do no wrong. He was the one who got praised for every little thing. From his high grades to his success in sports. I, on the other hand, was the one who tried hard but always seemed to fall short. I was used to being overlooked, and I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, if I worked harder, if I became the perfect son he wanted, he'd finally see me. But nothing changed. His focus was always on my brother. He got the praise, the attention, and the affection. I got the leftovers, the distant pats on the back, the forced smiles, the empty "I'm proud of you" statements that never felt real. I started to question my own worth. I wondered if I would always be in my brother's shadow, never good enough to be more than a mere afterthought. It ate away at me, and as much as I wanted to be the son my dad could be proud of, I couldn't help but feel resentment building inside me. It wasn't that I hated my brother. He didn't ask for this treatment, but it was impossible to ignore the constant comparison. The tipping point came when I realized something shocking. No matter how hard I worked, no matter what achievements I made, my dad was always going to put my brother first. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. It was then that I made a decision, one that would change everything. I wasn't going to play second fiddle anymore. I wasn't going to be the one who stayed in my brother's shadow. I was going to prove not just to my dad but to myself that I didn't need his approval. I could build my own empire. And when I did, I would leave them both behind. This wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about showing them all that I was capable of more than they ever gave me credit for. I would show them that I didn't need their love to succeed, and I would do it without their help. I wasn't a troublemaker, but I was always compared to Chris. I got decent grades, I was a good kid, but somehow it wasn't enough. My dad would say things like, "You need to be more like Chris. Look at what he's doing. Why can't you be more like that?" Every compliment he gave me felt like it was laced with a hint of disappointment. It was as if nothing I did could ever match up to the pedestal Chris was on. And as we grew older, the differences became more stark. When I got into high school, things started to shift in a way that would change everything. Chris had always been the popular one, the one everyone wanted to hang out with, and the one my dad was constantly comparing me to. But when it came to sports, I started to excel. I was a natural at basketball, and I joined the team. I worked hard, practicing long hours, and soon I was the star player. But no matter what I achieved, it was still Chris who was the golden boy. I remember the night of the biggest game of the season. I scored the winning shot, the whole gym went wild, and everyone was talking about how amazing I was. But my dad, he didn't even show up. He had gone to one of Chris's choir performances instead. That night, I came home and found him sitting in the living room waiting for me. He didn't say a word about the game. Instead, he asked about Chris's concert, how it went, what songs they sang. My heart sank. All the hard work I put in, all the hours I spent getting better at basketball, seemed to fade into the background. My dad didn't even care. It was then that I realized something that shook me to my core. I was never going to be good enough for him. No matter how much I did, how much I succeeded, it would always be overshadowed by Chris. I spent the next few years trying to get his attention in any way I could. But each time I tried, I felt myself drifting further away from who I wanted to be. I was constantly fighting to get recognized, and it wasn't just in sports or school. It was in everything. When I graduated high school, I decided to take a gap year before college. I wanted to prove to myself that I could stand on my own, that I could succeed without relying on anyone. But during that year, the realization hit me harder than ever. It wasn't just that I was trying to live up to my father's expectations. I was trying to prove something to myself that didn't need to be proven. I was more than capable, and I was tired of pretending that my worth was tied to his approval. My father's favoritism, though it had shaped much of my childhood, was no longer a chain I was willing to carry. That year, I started small. I took odd jobs, saved money, and began learning about business. I studied everything I could, learning from successful entrepreneurs and reading books that shifted my perspective. For the first time in my life, I wasn't working to impress my dad. I was working to impress myself. And when I started to make a little money from my side ventures, I felt something shift. This was just the beginning, and I knew I had the potential to go much further. But there was one thing that gnawed at me. The anger, the resentment that had been building up over the years. I wasn't just hurt by my dad's favoritism, I was furious at how he had made me feel like I wasn't enough. That every success I had was overshadowed by my brother's achievements. I needed to take control of my own life, and I couldn't do that with my dad constantly hovering over me, reminding me that I would never be the one he would choose. It was then that I decided that I wasn't going to wait for my dad to recognize my success. I was going to make my success so undeniable that there would be no way for him to ignore it. I wasn't going to beg for his approval anymore. I was going to create something so grand, something so impactful, that even he would have no choice but to see me for what I truly was. A success, not in spite of his neglect, but because of it. I began putting everything I had into my side business. The frustration, the anger, the rejection, it all fueled me. And slowly it started to pay off. As my business grew, so did my resolve. Every deal I closed, every new client I secured was another victory that was mine and mine alone. My dad's shadow loomed large, but the more I succeeded, the less it seemed to matter. I was finally doing things on my own, and I began to feel like the person I always knew I could be. But even with this newfound confidence, a part of me couldn't help but keep an eye on my dad and Chris. They were still the same. Chris still got all the praise. And my dad's attention was still focused on him. I couldn't help but feel a little resentment rise every time I heard about my brother's latest achievement. Every win for Chris felt like a slap in the face. But this time, I was determined not to let it affect me. Then, one evening, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. I had been working late in my home office, but I was too tired to focus. I heard my dad and Chris talking in the living room. My dad's voice was low, but clear enough for me to hear every word. At first, I tried to ignore it, focusing on my laptop screen. But something about the conversation caught my attention. I couldn't resist. I stood up and quietly made my way to the door, hoping to hear more. "Chris, I know you're doing well at school, but you're going to need more than just grades to make it in life," my dad said. "You've got to have connections. Money. That's the way the world works. And, I've been thinking maybe it's time we give you a little help with that." I felt a sickening twist in my stomach. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to catch more of what they were saying. "I've been setting up some investments. I think you're ready to start making moves with some of it," my dad continued. "If you can handle the responsibility, I'll help you build your future. I've already made the necessary calls." Chris didn't respond immediately, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Are you sure about this, Dad? I don't want to mess it up." "You won't," my dad said firmly. "Trust me. This is the opportunity you need to get ahead, and I've got your back." My heart raced. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad, the one who had always told me that I needed to work harder, that I wasn't quite enough, was now using his money and connections to give Chris an advantage. A head start, in a way. And the worst part? Chris didn't even need it. He was already doing well for himself. But my dad wasn't doing this because he had to. He was doing it because he wanted to. He wanted to see Chris win while I was left to figure things out alone. As I stood there, a wave of anger washed over me. I realized that my dad's plan wasn't just about helping Chris, it was about keeping me down, keeping me in the shadows. It wasn't just about business, it was about control. He wanted to dictate how my success would look. And as long as I was still seeking his approval, I would never be free from that control. This wasn't just a fight for recognition anymore. It was a fight for my freedom. My dad had been undermining me for years, and I was done being invisible. I couldn't let this go. I couldn't allow him to keep treating me like I was secondary. That moment marked a turning point for me. I would show him that I didn't need his money, his connections, or his help. I had already built something on my own, and I was going to make sure it was big enough for everyone to notice. I was done trying to please him. Now it was about proving to myself and to him that I didn't need him to succeed. The idea started to form in my mind. I would make my business more than just successful. I would make it unstoppable. I would grow it so large that my dad couldn't help but notice. And when he did, I would let him know that I had done it without his help, without his money, and most importantly, without his approval. But it wasn't enough just to succeed. I had to make sure that he knew it was because of him that I succeeded. I had to take everything he tried to control and turn it into the reason I flourished. I wasn't going to let him get away with using his wealth and influence to favor one son over the other. I wasn't going to be his project anymore. I would make my success undeniable, and when I reached the top, I'd let him watch from the sidelines. But I needed to take it a step further. It wasn't just about building my empire, it was about making sure he knew that he had lost. I would make it clear that his favoritism had cost him everything. And when I achieved it, I would leave him behind, just as he had left me behind all those years ago. The plan was in motion, and I wasn't going to stop until I saw it through. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I had already come too far to back down now. The moment of truth was coming. The moment when I would take control and nothing would stand in my way. As the months passed, my business grew exponentially. What started as a small side venture had turned into something I couldn't have imagined. The revenue was flowing in, the clients were lining up, and the recognition was becoming undeniable. I had put everything into this, my time, my energy, and all of my frustration. And every time I crossed another milestone, I thought back to that conversation I had overheard with my dad. It was a reminder of why I was doing this, why I had to make it big, even bigger than they ever thought possible. I was close now, close to the point where I could execute the final stage of my plan. And it would be simple, public, unavoidable, and ultimately crushing. My success was going to hurt them, not just because of how big it was, but because it was mine, and it was achieved without any of their help or approval. They had tried to control my life, but now I would show them who was in control. The day came sooner than expected. I had reached a pivotal moment in my business. My first multi-million-dollar deal was signed. It was a game changer. I had finally built something substantial. And the best part? I had done it all on my own. No handouts, no daddy's money, no family connections, just me and my relentless pursuit of success. It was a moment of absolute triumph. But I knew the moment would be sweeter if they knew exactly who was responsible for my success. So I planned it meticulously. I arranged a meeting with my dad. I knew that he had been keeping tabs on my progress, probably thinking it was a fluke, a phase that would pass. I was about to prove him wrong. I invited my dad and Chris to a dinner, just the three of us. The venue was exclusive, the atmosphere sophisticated, and I knew it would set the stage perfectly for what was about to unfold. We sat at the table, sipping wine, making small talk. But I could feel the tension building inside me. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change. "So, how's everything going with your business?" my dad asked, as if he had no idea how big it had gotten. I could see the subtle skepticism in his eyes, the disbelief that I could have actually made something out of nothing. I leaned back in my chair, a small smile on my face. "It's going great, Dad. In fact, I've just closed a huge deal. My company just hit a milestone I never thought possible." I saw Chris glance at me, his usual nonchalant attitude now replaced by genuine curiosity. I could tell he had no idea how big things had gotten. They were both in the dark, thinking I was still struggling. And I relished every second of it. "But I wanted to share something with you both," I continued, my voice calm but with a weight behind it. "I've just finalized a contract that's worth more than you can imagine. And I did it all on my own. No handouts. No help from anyone. Just me." There was a brief moment of silence. I could see my dad's face freeze, his expression changing from surprise to something I couldn't quite read. Chris looked visibly taken aback as well, probably processing the fact that his little brother was now in a completely different league than he had ever expected. "I've built my empire from the ground up," I added, leaning forward. "And I'm proud to say it's mine. Completely mine. I didn't need anyone else's approval, and I didn't need to be anyone's second choice." The silence in the room was deafening. My dad didn't know how to respond. I could see the realization hitting him. He had spent all these years ignoring my potential, focusing only on Chris, and now here I was, standing on my own 2 feet, with something that he could never take away from me. This was my moment. Chris opened his mouth to say something, but I quickly cut him off. "I don't need you to defend me, Chris. I've spent my entire life trying to get your approval, but it's not about that anymore. I don't need anyone's validation. I did this for me." I could see the weight of my words sink in, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely free. I didn't need their approval anymore, and I certainly didn't need their permission to succeed. My dad's face went pale, and Chris's expression shifted from confusion to discomfort. He didn't understand why I was doing this, why I was making such a public display of my success, but I knew it wasn't for them. It was for me. For all those years of being overlooked, for every time I was told I wasn't good enough. I had proven them wrong, and that was all that mattered. The evening ended quietly. There were no congratulations, no words of pride from my dad. There were only awkward silences and uncomfortable glances. But I didn't care. I had already won. I knew that I was no longer that invisible kid, struggling to get attention. I had built something on my own, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. As I walked out of the restaurant, the weight I had carried for so long finally lifted. I had won, and it felt damn good. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. My success continued to soar, and as the business grew, so did my confidence. Every new deal, every successful contract felt like a victory, not just for the business, but for me personally. I wasn't just proving to my dad and Chris that I could succeed. I was proving it to myself. I was no longer the kid in their shadow. I was the one in control, making decisions that shaped my future. I kept my focus on the business, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop thinking about the aftermath of that dinner. I could feel a shift in my dad's attitude. He didn't want to acknowledge it, but I knew he was watching me now in a way he hadn't before. Maybe it was out of jealousy, maybe it was guilt, but I didn't need his acknowledgement anymore. What mattered was that I had done it all on my own, and I wasn't looking back. Weeks passed without much communication from my family. My dad and I would exchange the occasional text about work, but it was always business related. There were no apologies, no attempts to rebuild the connection we once had. Chris, too, seemed to keep his distance, maybe feeling uncomfortable with the new dynamic. I think he had always seen me as the younger, less successful sibling, the one who couldn't keep up. But now, that perception had completely flipped. And I could tell he didn't know how to handle it. I'd be lying if I said it didn't sting a little. There were moments when I felt the emptiness of not having their support. I had spent my whole life seeking validation from my dad, trying to prove that I was worthy. But as time went on, I realized that their approval wasn't something I needed anymore. It wasn't that I didn't care about them, but I had finally learned that I didn't need to be their second choice, their backup plan. I was my first choice, and that was all that mattered. Eventually, I received a call from my dad. It was late one evening, and I wasn't sure what to expect. We hadn't spoken much since that dinner, and the silence between us had been deafening. He started with the usual pleasantries, but there was a hesitance in his voice that I hadn't heard before. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You know, I've always been proud of you, even if I didn't always show it." I was quiet for a moment, trying to process what he had said. Was this an apology? Was he finally admitting that he had made a mistake? "I know I didn't always give you the credit you deserved," he continued, sounding almost defeated. "I've been hard on you and I've taken you for granted. But I see now that I was wrong. You've done something amazing, and I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished." It was the first time in my life that I had heard my dad speak those words to me. But even as the words left his mouth, I didn't feel the sense of triumph I thought I would. The validation I had always sought was suddenly irrelevant. I had reached a point where I didn't need him to say those words to feel validated. I had already done it on my own. "I appreciate that, Dad," I said calmly, "but I'm not doing this for you. I did this for myself. I built something that's mine, and that's the only approval I need now." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear him taking in what I said. I wasn't angry, but I knew that our relationship could never go back to what it was. We had reached a breaking point, and we couldn't go back. The following days brought a strange calm. I focused on my business, and while I had reached a place of emotional peace, I realized that I didn't need to keep fighting for my dad's approval anymore. I was free of that. My empire was mine, and that was all that mattered. Chris, too, seemed to take a step back. I don't know if he was ashamed or if he simply didn't know how to handle the new power dynamic. But either way, I no longer needed to compete with him. The resentment I had carried for years started to fade. I wasn't interested in being a pawn in their game anymore. I had found my own way, and I had built something incredible. Months later, I stood in the middle of my office overlooking the city skyline. The world felt different. I wasn't the kid trying to prove himself to anyone. I had done it. I had built something lasting, something that was truly mine. My family was still a part of my life, but they were no longer the ones I was trying to impress. I had finally reached the point where I could say that I was proud of myself. And as for my dad and Chris, well, they could watch from the sidelines. They had underestimated me, but now I was the one who held the power. I had built my empire, and I had left them behind.